A gap opens between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, with Donald Trump saying there is real starvation in Gaza. The UK says it will recognise a state of Palestine, and the war goes on. I'm Jonathan Freedland in London.
And I'm Yonit Levi in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. Before anything else, I think we should tell our listeners that we have... You know what? Let's say this story. We'll tell the story a little differently. If there is a consistent complaint that our listeners do voice, and remember, this is a podcast about Israel and Jewish world, so occasionally one listener could argue with themselves while complaining about something on the podcast. So if there's a consistent complaint, it is that we talk a lot, Jonathan, you and I, about, obviously, Israel, the United States, the UK, but that there are other very big communities, Jewish communities in the world, which we mention, but we wanted to kind of focus on them for our August episode. So I'm really excited about this because some of the conversations already happened and they're very, very good and very interesting. It will be our Unholy World Tour. And those are the conversations that we will bring you from August 1st, actually.
Yeah, it's our summer tour. We are effectively on the road with conversations, I think, Argentina, Australia, other points on the global map. So checking in with Jewish communities outside, as you say, the kind of regular frame. So we've got those to look forward to, and there will come all throughout August. Meanwhile, busy time where you are, obviously.
Is it ever not? Yes. So this is a week that under fierce international pressure, Israel essentially had to backtrack and allow for 10 hours a day of humanitarian pause and humanitarian trucks from the UN and NGOs to come in and essentially flood the Gaza Strip with food. This is, in so many words, an admission of the failure of the Gaza Humanitarian Fund and the plan, which, again, on paper was a good plan, to detach the aid from the hands of Hamas, American contractors, Israeli IDF security. But 2 months later, into the work of this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, what was called by Netanyahu and Smotrich the game changer, Israel is accused of starving the population. 40 IDF soldiers dead since May, and not one single hostage released, and Israel having to essentially backtrack its plan and, as I said, allow for the UN and other NGOs to come in. A lot to say about this, and of course of the decision, by several countries, which we'll get into. You're sitting in one of them, to talk about a recognition of a Palestinian state when, seeing the images coming out from Gaza.
So just on that first thing, I mean, the UN and other agencies don't say it's a flood. They say this is nowhere near enough, that they have, in that window, those pauses, they are getting some aid in, but they say it's not close to the 500 or 600 trucks a day that are needed. But obviously, the drumbeat, we talked about that a lot on the podcast last week, they demand around the world for action, very, very loud. But tell me how inside Israel, that opening, that sort of, loosening of the restrictions for those limited periods, how is that playing? Because for a long time, the assumption was that Netanyahu couldn't do it because somehow it would be unpopular or whatever. It would be seen as showing weakness, particularly to his far-right coalition members. Has he paid a political price? Is it unpopular? Or just even politically among his coalition partners, for him to be doing this, even in the limited way we're describing?
So I would say that what aired this week is, of course, the promises of Netanyahu and particularly Smotrich that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation will be the answer to all of Israel's issues. And I think we should probably stress this point. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was not set up to starve the people of Gaza. It was set up to feed the people of Gaza, just so we get that out of the way. But I think that what is seen in Israel, and this is really interesting, because the one man to watch here is Smotrich, right? He was the one who promised that this was a plan. There is no way that the UN, the NGOs, and others will be, distributing the aid. Now, Israel has to backtrack on that. And he was the one, he was pretty quiet for about a day and a half. And then he said, there's something big coming. And this is the excuse essentially for him staying in the government. What is that big thing? Everyone thinks that that is a promise by Netanyahu to somehow annex parts of at least the perimeter of the Gaza Strip and thus say, here, we will promise that Hamas can never do this again. So there isn't a whole lot of criticism about this aid coming in or, in larger numbers. I think the Israelis were very aware of the criticism coming out from the rest of the world of the situation in Gaza. And so that I don't think that he's paying a political price because many Israelis think he's making the right decision.
Yeah. I mean, just on the point about Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, about its purpose, I would say its purpose was about wresting control of the food supply from Hamas, that it had a political purpose. I don't think its purpose...
Is that a bad thing?
Not at all. I don't think its prime purpose was humanitarian, despite its name. I don't think its prime purpose was to ensure the people of Gaza were fed. I think it was a political aim, which is let's wrest control from Hamas. And if more people are fed, good, but it's not the central purpose. If it were, it wouldn't have just 4 distribution centers, some of them open for as briefly, for as a shorter period as 11 minutes. That just isn't, if your aim was feeding the people of Gaza, you wouldn't do it that way. And we've seen that in its results, which is, obviously people hungry and tremendous violence at those distribution sites. So I think if your aim is humanitarian, one would have approached it differently. If the aim is political, then it's different. So I think it's, this is one of the things the aid agencies say. It didn't sort of comply with regular humanitarian practice because its purpose was political. I think this is all something we might get into, by the way, with our guest.
I think if we zoom out just for a minute, this is what we need to be looking at, whether it be the Gaza humanitarian aid, the UN, which I think we should not look at as a neutral player in this at all. But I think there's a larger picture here. And the larger picture is that the Israeli government set as one of the goals of this war dismantling the civil system managed by Hamas, right? And this was carried out with great skill, but without establishing any alternative for managing the population. And the population, just for our Israeli listeners, is the size of Israel in the 1960s. And if you don't put anyone responsible, the Palestinian Authority, or don't call it the Palestinian Authority, or Arab nations, or Martians, anyone who would build back the infrastructure, then at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you and I sit here and argue if 400 trucks is enough or 600 trucks are enough, or is flowing in or isn't flowing in, because you're going to have the same problem over and over again. And the frustrating thing, I think, for many Israelis is, again, zooming out, a country who took out, treated Iran's airspace as its playground after 36 hours, doesn't have the strategic viewpoint of saying this has to be resolved somehow. And I think that is the main thing. I mean, we could have the same conversation we had last week about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and the UN not cooperating and what Israel did. And we can continue to have that. But I think this is the main point. You have to set up an infrastructure and an apparatus to somehow deal with the fact there are 2 million people there that need food and other things.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it reminds me, do you remember the old pottery barn rule that Colin Powell is said to have advised George W. Bush about invading Iraq? The pottery barn store in the United States. If you break it, you own it. And in a way, there's a version of that here, which is, sure, make it a goal that you, rather than Hamas, are in charge, for example, of the food supply, but in general, that you're running the show. The drawback of that is you are then responsible. So if people are hungry, that's going to be on you. And many people from the beginning were saying, Hamas have to be out of the picture. I would agree with that. Absolutely. But therefore, somebody else has to be in that picture. And this is the question. I'm just absolutely reinforcing and agreeing with what you've said. That was the question that Netanyahu would never answer. He wouldn't even address it, let alone do something about it. He wouldn't talk about the day after. And so we're in the position we're in. The thing I was going to just say is that much of the diplomatic or political activity internationally happened in the United Kingdom this week, partly because Donald Trump was on a 4-day visit to his beloved golf courses in Scotland. He brought his usual political style with him, and so did a freewheeling press news conference, very unfamiliar to his host, the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. But it was as part of that that Donald Trump was asked about whether he would agree with Benjamin Netanyahu's account of the situation, which included a sort of downplaying of the crisis of hunger. And he said, not particularly, meaning I wouldn't particularly agree with Netanyahu. He said there is, quote, real starvation, which in a way politically that becomes a sort of the key fact. He thinks it as Israel's most important ally. And he said, very, very Donald Trump, I've seen it on television. I've seen those pictures on television. And we know from Donald Trump's own sort of advisors that what he sees on TV really matters. That's how things go into his brain, is if he sees them on TV. And he particularly has an aversion to seeing pictures, I suppose, like every other human being, pictures of suffering on TV. His attitude on geopolitical questions is often essentially, get that off my TV. I don't want to see that. And the events of the last week or two put the Gaza hunger crisis into that category. And the result is now daylight, a gap between Donald Trump and his Israeli counterpart on this issue. That then becomes a kind of political fact. I don't think you can sort of, if you're Netanyahu, I don't think you can start sort of arguing the point. He now has to manage that reality that he has a president who doesn't see this crisis the way he does.
Yes, and I think on the matter of images, we should say something about the image that went around the world, including the Daily Express, which was, I think, a watershed moment, because the Daily Express can't be accused of being an anti-Israel newspaper. The picture of Gazan child Muhammad al-Matouk that appeared on all of these newspapers, and the information coming out now, and some of the newspapers apologizing, saying this is not a child dying of hunger. He's actually sick and has other conditions. Look, it was Harry Truman who said about Roosevelt, hiding Roosevelt's condition from the American people. He said, the truth is so fragile, it needs to be surrounded by bodyguards of lies. And I think that is kind of the feeling here, that there is truth, but there's also a whole lot of lies. The truth is that there is hunger in Gaza. To what extent, how this compares to other war zones, I don't know. But it was definitely this week at a critical moment that all bells everyone had to ring the bells in English and in Hebrew and say, we are on the brink of a catastrophe, let more humanitarian aid in. There's also the truth that says Hamas is manipulating this in every way possible and now hoping that the world will force Israel to stop the war. So there's absolutely no progress made on a deal or a ceasefire or release of hostages. And there are a lot of other little lies around this. So it's very, very hard to know, where we are with all of this noise. I think for Israelis, to the extent that I could represent it, the fact that everyone is now talking, everyone meaning your government and the French government, talking about the option of a recognition of Palestinian state. By the way, this has just the issue of declaring it, but it doesn't have that change on the ground. What could happen is economic sanctions on Israel. It's, of course, a very serious thing. I think for many Israelis, the thinking on that is, wait a minute, there is the biggest terror attack against Israel, and I think by size, the biggest terror attack in the world. And what happens 2 years later is that Hamas will be holding the prize for the Palestinian, the perpetrators of this attack will be holding the prize for the Palestinian people, saying, this is a Palestinian state. Where historic reality is, Palestinians could have had a state 30 years ago if Hamas hadn't tried to blow up every attempt to reach a Palestinian state in the past. So there's a lot going on there, what I was trying to say. But, I think that is the feeling of the sentiment this week.
Very interesting. I mean, you've gone through a lot of...
a lot to unpack there.
A lot to unpack there, exactly. So I think you spoke very well about the photograph and that complex thing where the one specific is challenged, but the bigger picture remains the way it was. A lot of people latched onto these questions over that photograph to say, oh, well, therefore you can't believe anything about the whole thing. The whole thing is invented. And that argument, which, by the way, is advanced by people quite high up in the Israeli government, the whole thing is this invention. It requires you to believe that every organization now in the world is part of, in effect, a sort of an agreed conspiracy to lie about this thing and serve Hamas propaganda. And, I know that people have their objections absolutely to the United Nations, but you have to then also throw in the World Health Organization and, the Norwegian Refugee Foundation and the body which is regarded as the most authoritative monitor of food insecurity in the world, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, the IPC, which this week said that the worst case scenario of famine is being played out in Gaza. And so that seems to me equally outlandish in a way to suggest that, the BBC and the Associated Press and Reuters and every international aid agency, they're all in it together to sort of serve this Hamas talking point, even though, as you say, that absolutely is the case. Two important things about Hamas. One, they do indeed manipulate the reality and monitor very closely, monitor being a very polite word, what reporters and camera people are able to show, photographers, camera operators are allowed to show in Gaza. Mm-hmm. And second, that they have no compunction about their own people suffering. They don't mind if their own people starve. For them, that just serves their own purposes in propaganda terms. This was always one of the reasons why I always believed from the beginning that the idea of any kind of restrictions on aid, withholding aid, was always doomed, because Hamas won't care if their populations suffer, and it never does succeed in this goal of turning turning the population against Hamas. It's always doomed. Since we're sort of mentioning things as postscript to last week, I mentioned last week this idea that, and I wasn't able to attribute it, of really flooding the zone with much more aid than is needed in order to, in effect, drive down the value of aid, so its black market value diminishes, and that Hamas are therefore left without that leverage, that currency of aid that they had. I just want to attribute it. The idea comes from, among others, but Alex Stein, who on Substack writes a Substack called Love of the Land. It was he who made this point very, very well in a piece a week or so ago, and so I just want to give credit where it is due for that. One thing does strike me is there is something slightly contradictory in how the Israeli government has reacted to this, because on the one hand they say this is irrelevant, it's meaningless, we don't care. I heard one ally of Netanyahu say it's much ado about nothing, it doesn't make any difference.
Well, at least read Shakespeare.
Something. And then on the other hand, there's this kind of vehemence of the response. It's appeasement. It's that the jihadist threat is going to come for you next. I'm Churchill, you're Neville Chamberlain, was the implication of Netanyahu's tweet to Keir Starmer. That sounds like it's a big deal. So is this one of those things, which one are we meant to believe? That this is nothing, water off a duck's back, the Israelis are shrugging this off? Or is this actually quite a serious thing from Israeli policymakers' point of view? How do you see it?
No, I think it is a very serious thing for Israelis, because policymakers are saying contradicting things. It's Israel, and I think that happens also outside of Israel as well. But I think that for Israelis, and I mentioned that before, mainstream Israelis, they don't have to be right-wing at all, but they would think that at the end of the day, if 2 years into this terrible terror attack, what happens is that the world is now saying, recognize a Palestinian state, which is a huge prize for Hamas. And again, we can't stress this enough, I think. There could have been a Palestinian state 30 years ago if it wasn't for Hamas going, in this wave of terror attacks, doing everything it can to sabotage that attempt. So I think for Israelis, this means a lot, and they realize the ramifications of this. It's a declarative move, but it has a lot of significance, particularly if there is a financial aspect to it as well. We will have this week a bonus episode about that recognition to sort of expand on what that means from the Israeli perspective and from the international perspective as well.
And just one last thing on that. I think you're absolutely right about the Israelis will see it as a reward for Hamas. Interestingly, outside, that distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian people, the Palestinian population, is made perhaps much more readily. In other words, I think people think it's quite possible to say we hate and despise Hamas, but the Palestinian people deserve to determine their own future, and this is a reward, as it were, to them rather than to Hamas. That's a distinction that people make outside. I can see from what you've said how and why that doesn't figure in Israeli publics, in the Israeli public's thinking. That's just, one of many such differences. So this is all part of the picture. So this is all part of the current landscape. There are so many different elements and so many different things going on. We thought it was absolutely the time to check in with the person we turn to so often, great friend of the podcast, and a very sage view on all of these matters.
Amos Harel is the military and defense analyst for Haaretz newspaper, the author of 3 best-selling books, and as Jonathan said, the person we always turn to when we want to figure out what is going on in the war in Gaza and the rest of the region. Amos, thank you for talking to us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Always a pleasure to have you on. I have to describe to our listeners what happened to me last Sunday. It was my life between Amos and Jonathan. What happened was I was reading the first chapter of what I think will become the definitive account of October 7th, Amos's book. And it really is amazingly written, and you kind of want to tear all of your hair out of frustration, what happened in those hours that led to October 7th and the hours right after. And I finished reading that draft of the first chapter. Jonathan sends me The World This Weekend, the BBC's program, Life in Gaza. And I listened for half an hour to what the BBC is broadcasting about life in Gaza. And I'm telling you this story because, first of all, obviously I need to get new friends who send me happy things and make me feel better. But also because when you think of that trajectory, those 2 years between the greatest catastrophe to befall Jews in Israel, everyone in Israel, and the reaction to Israel now as being, in many cases on the verge of a pariah state. I mean, I don't want to ask you almost how we got there, but I guess my first question to you, and maybe it's no less difficult, how do we emerge from this war?
Well, I'll escape your question by saying it's too soon to tell. It's rather difficult to understand where we're heading right now. Netanyahu is a man who says different things to different people all the time. In the past, called by Smotrich a liar and a son of a liar. It's pretty clear right now that he's winging it. He's trying to somehow improvise. There's a long discussion whether there's a strategy there. My editor in Haaretz, Aluf Ben, claims that there is one and that he's actually heading in the same direction as Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Others, like Aviv Drucker, would tell you that this is all improvisation. It's all about staying in power. The main thing is to avoid elections in which currently, according to the polls, he might lose. And this is where we are right now. It gets even more difficult because we have Trump on a very Trumpian character or mood, should we say, right now. In the past, even if we could not believe Netanyahu, we always listened to Trump. We said, okay, he sometimes does tell the truth, and it's apparent where things are heading. Right now, the president keeps contradicting himself. One day he's worried about starving children in Gaza. On the other day, he says that Hamas just wants to die and maybe we should help them achieve their goal. So it's hard to tell. I think we don't know yet where we are. It's pretty clear that we arrived exactly where we were heading for a long time, meaning that the decision not to search for any kind of a final agreement in Gaza, but to continue the war endlessly, to keep promising the Israeli public that hope and victory are around the corner. There's a very high price to pay for that. Now, a large part of the Israeli public would tell you this is a story of crime and punishment. October 7th happened, serves them right. This is what happens to the Gazans right now. At least many people on the right wing in Israel believe in that. They say we should have reacted as aggressively as possible. Something biblical happened to us, and our response should be biblical as well. 60,000 dead Palestinians later, this becomes a huge problem for Israel because, again, the international community, except for the Americans and perhaps some right-wing leaders in Europe, do not understand where this is going.
I just want to pick up on that thing of except the United States, because something that Yonit and I have talked about even on this episode, is this sense that the only country that matters politically, diplomatically, in terms of pressure on Netanyahu is the United States. That he sort of says to the rest of the world, go hang. It's the word of Trump that matters. Just in terms of militarily, is that the case, that the only country that has actual leverage on Israel's ability to keep fighting is the United States? And in a way, to put the same question a slightly different way, if Donald Trump were, rather than zipping all over the map, as you were explaining, saying one thing one day and one thing the next, was to be consistent and say, Bibi, enough, stop, does he have that power? Could he, just by making the decision, pull the plug on this war because Israel is so dependent militarily, or does he not have that power?
So it's mostly about the United States. It's true that other countries such as the UK and France decided on all kinds of short-term embargoes regarding weapons to Israel during this war, especially if you recall during the campaign in Rafah in May 24, then there were a lot of heated discussions between Netanyahu and Biden, and even Biden decided not to give Israel those D9 Caterpillars and to avoid sending heavy ammunition to the Israeli Air Force. But when Netanyahu was facing Biden, he could wing it as well. He could somehow handle this and avoid a full-scale escalation of the United States. And even when it came to American response to the negotiations regarding the hostages, time after time, people like Sullivan and others were supporting the Israeli position publicly, even if they disagreed with it in closed rooms. With Trump, it's more difficult. First of all, he's a different character, and I didn't see any, maybe Zelensky for a bit, but I didn't see any world leaders actually willing to fight him publicly in front of the press, considering the possible.
If you're not Zelensky.
And the possible consequences. And we saw what happened to Zelensky to some extent. So I don't think that Netanyahu would dare that. But will Trump go all the way against Israel? I don't see this happening right now. Never say never in this world, especially with the president. I don't think it's likely. But going back to your introduction to the question, again, this is a long-held belief by Netanyahu for quite some years that not only don't we need the other parts of the regions of the world, we only need the Republicans. He's lost hope regarding Democrats since a long time ago. He's even lost some interest towards Jewish American public, whether it's more liberal Jews, whether it's reforms of the conservative movement among American Jewry and so on. There was a quote, I think he never denied that, correct me if I'm wrong, Yonit, but he was once asked about, he said, you know the difference between Trump and the leaders of the reform community in the United States? He says Trump has Jewish grandchildren. And this is hoping that Trump would save us, hoping that the evangelists would save us, time and time again, has become part of the Netanyahu MO for quite a few years.
But just on the military point, I just want to know if that degree of dependency, could Netanyahu fight the war if Trump doesn't back him militarily?
When Gallant, you remember Gallant a long time ago, the former defense minister, had those debates with the Americans, he said, we'll fight them tooth and nail if we have to. All I need is my M4, M16, and I'll deal with Hamas if you refuse to give us the ammunition. Now, the ammunition is also American. M16 is an American-made rifle. And there's a very high dependency. Israel could deal with that for a certain amount of time, but in the long run, we need the Americans, although we've passed the Iranian challenge and the Hezbollah challenge quite successfully. What remains of Hamas is not that much of a military challenge. That's not the big deal there. The big deal is how to control the Strip, how to regain access to the hostages, how to help them being released. This is the problem, not defeating Hamas on the battlefield. Hamas is no longer a military organization. It's a guerrilla organization, small groups of hoodlums working as terrorists or small units of guerrilla. It's very, very different than the original hierarchy they had 18 or 20 months ago.
So that leads me to my next question, because we're 663 days into the war. It's a year and 10 months. So you say Hamas is now guerrilla, more than a guerrilla than a military. What is the Israeli military actually doing in Gaza? And the decision to go into areas that thus far Israel did not step into, because particularly not to harm the hostages, how does that all work into the military's plan?
Well, actually, it's not doing a lot. There's a lot of death, a lot of misery, a lot of destruction. They're destroying houses right and left all the time, buildings all over the place. But there's not much military friction in the end. What you have are many casualties, some of them Hamas terrorist fighters, some of them civilians. I think most of them by now civilians. And that has to do mostly with either Israeli artillery or Air Force strikes, again, focused on Hamas militants, but hitting quite a lot of, and killing quite a lot of civilians. What you have every day, it's the war of the bulldozer by now. I've been recently to Bet Hanun, which is in the northern part of the Strip. It looks worse than Jabalia looked the last time I visited on December 24 in that part of the Strip. There's more destruction, but mostly what the IDF does is destroy buildings above ground and search for tunnels, which are defensive tunnels. They do not cross the border towards Israel inside the Gaza Strip. Bet Hanun is about 2 miles away from the Israeli border. It does consist of threat to places like Sderot, but there's no chance of a tunnel crossing right now inside Israel. This is the type of war going on, while the other side, as you mentioned, what Hamas is doing is employing guerrilla tactics. They use snipers, they use explosives. Every now and then they manage to hit an Israeli tank or an armed personnel carrier with an RPG rocket. This is what they do. These are relatively young fighters, 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds, and so on. Not many commanders left. If you look at the leadership, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, his name now is Izzadin al-Haddad. He's the 4th leader they had since the beginning of the war. The previous 3 were assassinated by Israel. This is the type of war they're fighting, and they don't need to win it. As guerrillas, all they need to do is not lose all their battles. As long as they can inflict pain on the Israeli side, as long as they can manage to create some casualties on our side, and especially if they get it filmed and it's spread on video all over the place, it's pretty fine with them.
So my question is also about what's going on the ground, but it relates not to the ongoing fighting, but rather to this issue of aid. Because so much is said and so much is disputed. You now have this situation where there's kind of a consensus among all international organizations, governments, aid organizations, that there is desperate shortage, if not famine, on the ground. Israeli officials say, and not all of them, but they say that's Hamas propaganda. There's plenty. It's an issue of distribution and bottlenecks. We're reliant because, Israel doesn't allow free international media to report freely and unaccompanied there. So we're reliant on just people we know and people we talk to. You obviously talk to people all the time about what's on the ground. From what you know, what is the true picture in this very specific area of food and food distribution?
I'll start with exactly this caveat from what I know, and my knowledge is limited. But as you guys are fond of saying, the proof is in the pudding. If there was nothing happening there, then why did Netanyahu make such a fabulous U-turn on Saturday? After days, if not weeks, of denial, where Israel said nothing was going wrong, it mentioned, as you said, Hamas propaganda and so on, then Netanyahu made this spectacular U-turn and decided to deliver. I assume that this was international pressure pressure, and mainly, although it was never described that way, probably personal pressure from Trump and his people. But within a few hours, while comfortably enough, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir were offline because of the Sabbath, there was a decision made to deliver lots and lots of goods, to send in trucks, to allow the UN and other organizations to finally give assistance, something that Israel refused to do because we kept on obsessing about this solution with the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, this so-called American fund. There is still a story to be discovered and told there. But this is a very miserable Israeli failure. And as some people with a more conspirational manner would say, this was done intentionally. This was the Smotrich plan from the beginning. They wanted to starve the community in Gaza, the Gaza population, and this was meant to lead to this specific result. I'm not so sure. I think that although there were signs, although there were alarms being raised, I kept writing about this. Haaretz writers all the time. Since March, we warned from going back to war and deciding to be in breach of the ceasefire. And since May, we said that this plan with the GHF is not going to work simply because they were not delivering enough food. And on top of everything else, they're just delivering the food locally in southern Gaza Strip without providing help to the northern strip. And also on top of everything else, there was a hard time for people who are not that strong to actually reach their goal and actually receive their food. If you're, it's the chaos going on there for a long time means that there's no Gaza civilization anymore. I can never remember if it's a Stalin or Lenin, but the saying that culture is just 9 dinners away from chaos or anarchy. This is what's going on in Gaza for quite some time. If people are hungry, okay, they could get food, but getting food is very, very hard. You need the strong. Only the strong survives. If he's armed, it's easier. If he is part of some clan which either belongs to Hamas or a criminal gang, then his supply is more or less ensured. But if not, if you come from a family without a man in the head of that specific Palestinian household, if there are only young children there, if there are ill people in the family, what are the chances of them making it? So it doesn't have to be a deliberate Israeli plan of starvation. It just needs to be off mark, which is exactly what happened. Now, how serious is the situation? It's hard for me to tell, and I'm pretty aware of the fact that Hamas is misleading the international community, that it's playing all kinds of mind games, all kinds of psychological tricks on you guys as well. We've seen the New York Times now beginning to correct a mistake from a few days ago. The photograph of the kid, of the ill, very thin child held by his mother. It turns out that there's an illness there, a genetic illness as well. It's not only does it have to do with specific hunger in his area, and this is Hamas. I'm not surprised by this. But Israel can no longer deny that the problem exists. Yonit said that and caused quite a lot of public response this week while she said it on camera on Channel 12. It's not a matter of Hezbollah anymore. It's not a matter of, if we just explain it, if we just have Netanyahu, the best explainer, Mr. Hasbara, tell the world in his perfect English, and then everybody would be impressed and believe our innocence. That's not the case. We've long past that line.
We were talking about what the military is doing right now in Gaza. Let's talk about what it can do or planning to do, because the hostage deal ceasefire deal is clearly stuck. By the way, why would Hamas go for a deal now if it hopes that the international community will stop Israel anyway and Hamas won't have to release any hostages? So now we're stuck. And there's talk, Smotrich is talking about annexation. There was talk about occupying the whole of the Gaza Strip, although I think the military is now sitting at about 70 or 80% of the Strip. In any case, what are the plans that the military is writing these days if this continues to be the sort of stalemate on ceasefire and hostage deal?
So it goes back to your first question. What does Netanyahu want to begin with? What are the goals of this war? He keeps saying that it's about defeating or destroying or annihilating Hamas and bringing back the hostages. It's not clear whether you can do both things, achieve them at the same time. we're not there yet. I think he no longer promises that we're one step away from final victory. This is not the case. And now, as I said before, he's delivering different promises to different people. In the end, it's about his communication with Trump. What would be decided between the two of them once they finally speak on the phone and decide what the strategy is going to be. If not, then he will deal with conflicting pressures. Smotrich and Ben Gvir want one thing, the hostages families want something absolutely different, and the army has no appetite for destruction anymore. That's quite clear. Zamir has been saying that mostly. Every now and then he hints that when the IDF spokesperson releases his recordings, short videos of him speaking to soldiers in Gaza and so on. But mostly he's been saying that in closed rooms, and this is what got Smotrich so upset. Yesterday's leak, which an algorithm could have invented that before, said Smotrich says that he's already beginning to miss Haaretz. My
former chief of staff, we should say.
My lost love for Haaretz.
After showing him the door very clearly and telling him walk through it, he now misses
one
the chief of staff.
of the hostages' mothers tweeted immediately, "Well, I miss my son," which is a bigger problem, of course. But Zamir, it's never Smotrich's fault. It's always somebody else. It's like dealing with a child in a way. There's something, a megalomaniac about the whole situation, about believing that you're sort of a Napoleon who's hardly been in the army, but can solve everything by, in 5 quick steps, I'll show you how to win this round against Hamas. So the army, it's quite clear, is not fond of those ideas. If it's up to Zamir, it may be too late, as you've alluded before, Yonit. But if it's up to Zamir, then we reach a deal with Hamas and end this whole saga already. If not, Zamir would say, okay, let's try some more siege over certain enclaves in the region, in the Strip. Let's go for a war of attrition, something along these lines. He's not talking of full occupation of the Strip. He's not talking of military administration of the Palestinians. And he's actually leaking, I think it was my colleague Nir Dvori on Channel 12, who a few weeks ago published that the Army's plans this year for the Miliumniks, for the reservists, are for, on average, 74 days for this year of reserve duty. This is a lot, yet it's much lower than 150, 200 days that many of them served last year. What he's actually implying is that if Smotrich and Netanyahu insist on invading the whole Strip, it would be much higher than 74 days. But he's telling the public, look, it's not my fault. These guys are trying to move in that direction. It's up to you to help me prevent them from doing so. My fear is that if we're stuck and Trump loses interest, and he's already lost some interest after the Dan Alexander case, after he got the American hostage back, you see him being less emotional about the whole issue. He keeps saying, well, we brought more hostages than perhaps anybody in the world, and so on. What if he loses interest? What if in a week's time or a month's time he keeps talking about Ukraine or China or something else and stops talking about the hostages? Then Israel gets desperate. And then there could be a possibility in which, in spite of the hostages' families being in panic that their lives may be in danger, that somehow the public is convinced that the only way forward, if everything else is lost and all other roads are blocked, is to finally defeat Hamas. I don't see this as a realistic option, because how do you define victory over Hamas? Hamas no longer controls the Strip. It's about fighters, it's about terrorists caring about their own survival. And forgive me for saying this because it sounds like Israeli propaganda, but in the end, it's a win-win situation for people like Haddad. The suffering of their people is only something that could oil it's like spreading oil in this great system and this great production line of Palestinian suffering. This is what it's about, and they've been very, very successful at that. There's no longer a sense of responsibility. If Sinwar had it in the first place, he wouldn't have gone for the whole thing. But we haven't seen anybody, not Hania or others, some dead, some alive, who's expressed any kind of real sentiment or solidarity about the actual suffering, not the way they could use the suffering for political means.
Your point about Trump losing interest in hostages, something I noticed in his press conference when he was here in Scotland, in the UK, but speaking in Scotland, he made this point that, and he said it repeatedly, that he'd always believed that once Hamas were down to, as he put it, this is the language he used, the last 10 or 20 hostages,
It would
they
get
would
harder.
never move. It would get. He said they would never do it because he said that's their shield. They need that 10 or 20, he said, as their kind of insurance policy to guarantee their own survival. And I heard what you, I think, of saying that you heard, which is a kind of resignation there, as if to say, well, we're now at the final number. We're not going to get those, and as if he was washing his hands of it. I want to know if from you whether that's your reading of Hamas too, that they will not now make any kind of deal or bargain that involves giving away, as they would see it, their last remaining assets, and therefore that talk that some of us were hearing a few weeks ago about a breakthrough, a final deal, that there's some grounds for hope, in a way is doomed because they need to hold on to those last few for their own insurance. That is incredibly gloomy for the families of those remaining hostages. But what's your read of it?
Okay, so two issues here. First of all, Trump himself. Look, Trump is like, in a way, he's a TV persona first and foremost. And it's all about, I think I've said that in the past, about you not switching channels during commercials. He enjoys the focus on him. He enjoys the interest in what he says. He's like a sports analyst, okay? He's not giving you the American, the U.S.'s moral position over the fate of the hostages. He's like a guy in a sports bar talking about the next day's competition, right? This is what he says right now, and he's detached not from reality but from emotions regarding that. He was much more emotional in the past. The only guy that still expresses that kind of emotion is Steve Witkoff, and I don't know how strong he is, how influential he would be over the course of the negotiations from now on. Now, I share your suspicions, Jonathan, about this. I don't think all is lost. I think in the end, Hamas wants to survive, and yet it needs an end to the war because there's a certain danger to its own people. And even a guy like Haddad, who's deeply religious and extremely, his ideology is considered to be very, very extreme. I assume that most of these guys, when it comes to them and their families, they want to live. If this doesn't stop, Israel would kill him in the end, the way it did to the previous free leaders. So there is something to be lost on their side, and I think there is some temptation to reach a final deal. But what we should emphasize is the word final. They do not want another interim deal, and they feel that they have been misled by Netanyahu and Biden and Trump in the past, because in both cases, December 23, we've talked about that in the past, Hamas was in breach of the agreement. It did not release the young women hostages that it promised to deliver on December 1st, 23. And yet Israel decided to desert this direction of maintaining the ceasefire, and there was an ongoing debate. Gadi Eisenkot, for instance, at that time still a minister, felt that the right thing to do was continue with the ceasefire in spite of Hamas being in breach. March of this year, this is a very different story. Hamas generally stood up to its responsibilities and commitments. It did deliver what we demanded from them. Perhaps not exactly on time, but we got 30 live hostages back. And the thinking was, around Trump as well, was that this was about to continue. And yet Netanyahu decided to go back to fighting. And Netanyahu, what he keeps saying today to Smotrich, but sometimes to the Israeli people, is, don't worry, we'll find an excuse and we'll hit them again. We'll find them and kill them. If this is what Israel publicly promises Hamas, then Hamas has every reason to doubt our intentions. So this is all about guarantees in the end. What could Trump, who dislikes them, that's quite clear, promise them in order to persuade them to go for a deal? And this is what we mentioned in the past, what we call the corrales, pushing them forward into a very narrow corridor, pushing Netanyahu. And once he agrees to an interim agreement, then in the end, he'll have to reach the final deal. This is what Trump essentially believes in, and this is what Witkoff has been saying to the Qataris and especially to Hamas through the Qataris for the last few months. He hasn't delivered that yet, and it gets harder and harder, as Yonit has said, to provide this because of the humanitarian condition in Gaza. And no one could question that. This situation right now works for the benefit of Hamas and not Israel.
This might have to be our final question. I fear of asking it, kind of, but if, we're looking at what can stop this war? And you're saying Trump might not be that interested anymore. Netanyahu has his own coalition restraints. It doesn't look like Zamir, with all of his backbone, is someone who could say to the politicians, enough is enough. So this can continue for a very long time. No? I mean, what is the thing that can end the war?
It could happen. It could continue for a long time. And in that case, it would have to do with the Israeli public. And we haven't seen that. Both of us, I think Yonit, assumed after October 7th that the shockwaves were so wide and massive that at one point or another would see the country rising, would see a large part of the population of the political map demanding the government resign. This didn't happen. There were tens of thousands of people on the streets at the height of demonstrations, but it was nothing like the year of judicial upheaval that happened before the war. Because it's very, very hard to people to demonstrate against the government as their own sons and daughters are fighting in Rafah and Gaza. And as Israelis are held there, it's hard for you to blame the government as this is still going on. This is something very fundamental, I think, in every democratic society, but especially in Israel. If worse comes to worse and the war continues and there are more and more horrific events and more soldiers being killed and so on, perhaps there'll be a change in public opinion. What we saw after Iran is that Bibi was incapable of using those political chips, so to speak, to improve his situation in the polls. It just didn't happen. He finally actually delivered his promise to defeat Iran and to enlist the United States and to destroy Iranian nuclear sites, and all he got were 3 points in the polls. It didn't change much. The other issue, of course, is international response to that. For the time being, Bibi is worried, but not that worried. In the long run, we hear all kinds of frightening stories, whether it's Israeli tourists who are being refused to land on different Greek islands, whether it's anti-Semitic attacks everywhere from London to New York and other places against Israelis, against Jews, and so on. And we're having a huge problem, for instance, regarding those science and technology agreements with the European Union. In the long run, Israel, you've talked about that with Thomas Friedman last week, the danger of Israel becoming a pariah state, it's happening already. I mean, Israel and the Israeli society, the Israeli government, to an extent, the Israeli media, is in a state of denial over this as well, not only about starvation in Gaza.
Amos, you always enlighten us. I'm not sure you cheer us up. I'm thinking about
I haven't been able to cheer you for quite some time.
I'm not sure about that, but always absolutely illuminating, and we're really grateful to you, Amos Harel.
Thanks.
That line about the Israeli military losing its appetite for destruction, I think is important, because that is the sort of thing that everything rests upon. The Israeli military, the chief of staff, they want to go to hostage deal. They want a ceasefire in whatever volume that Yair Zamir is saying this to the Israeli government. And that is where we are right now. And of course, if the Israeli government, this is what happens in democracies decides to go forward, it can, the military can. But I think that it's important to say that at this moment, a year and 10 months into the war, this is what the military would prefer, to have this deal to end the war and to bring back the hostages.
Yeah, and they would obviously find a ready echo in Israeli public opinion for that. As always, great guide to everything going on from Amos Harel. We have our awards to hand out. I think you have a suggestion for the Chutzpah Award, Yonit.
Yes, I mean, look, it's a crowded field this week, and I did think, to begin with, of Hanoch Milvitsky, the Likud MK, who's under investigation for rape, which didn't prevent the Likud from approving him as the new head of the Knesset Finance Committee. By the way, he was supposed to be the head of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, the most important committee in the Knesset. Remember, they moved aside Yuli Edelstein because he wouldn't give Netanyahu and the Haredim the draft bill that they wanted. But Milvitsky had some issues that don't pertain pertain to the fact that he's also investigated under rape, but that he wasn't experienced enough to be the head of that committee. But they still wanted to give him some reward, so they made him the head of the finance committee. Opposition, of course, fighting this with every possible way, saying this is a moral stain on the Knesset. That did not help. I mean, the way to deal with this, by the way, is to say, look, this is a pending investigation. If we find out that he did indeed do this, we will move him. But that was not what was said. What was said is, the judiciary is wrong. We are going to put him in this place. So that is my first nominee. But in this week, really, Jonathan, I think what wins and takes the cake of the chutzpah is the decision made by the municipality in Holon, together with the Minister of Defense, Israel Katz, to turn what should be perhaps a somber moment, that is the demolition of the buildings that were hit very severely by Iranian missiles and now have to be rebuilt. Remember, these people now don't have where to live. They need to wait for their houses to be built again. Turning this into a celebration of recovery and, saying this is, calling it, having this pamphlet saying, come to our event. It's Am Yisrael Chai, having this whole, really celebration of a demolition of buildings that were severely hit. Some of the people from these buildings standing there saying, we need help, we need financial assistance. Why are you spending the money on this kind of ceremony? Again, such a moment in which Muli Segev, the good friend of the pod, who is the executive producer of Israel's satire program Eretz Nehederet, had to post this and write, this isn't us, right? This isn't satire, this is reality. But it does tell a story of, I think, this government and how it kind of deals with these kinds of situations.
Yeah, I'm sure they would say it's sort of, defiance or something, but yeah, baffling and hilarious that these, Israel's leading satirist had to say, we're not making this up. My own suggestion for the Chutzpah Award would be the Jerusalem Magistrates Court, which made a decision to release to house arrest Yinon Levi. He's a settler sanctioned by the United States for his involvement in violence against Palestinians. He is suspected of fatally shooting a well-known Palestinian activist, Auda Hatalin, involved in the campaign around Musafa Yatta and other villages there. He was about to have his case heard at the remand hearing. Already there was an unusual decision to allow him to meet members of his family in the courthouse yard, but then the Jerusalem Magistrates Court giving him the relatively, lax treatment of allowing him to be released to house arrest. This is not how somebody of such serious crimes, I think, we would normally expect to be treated, and yet the Jerusalem Magistrates Court making that decision. So a Chutzpah Award for them. For our Mensch category, a returning suggestion here, because they did what are we meant to say? We gave a Chutzpah Award, people will remember, not that long ago, to Grok, the AI sort of chatbot of the X platform, Elon Musk's personal chatbot, that was sounding off, saying that, Hitler had the right idea. Unbelievable stream of anti-Semitism came from Grok. The people have been in the lab and changed Grok's kind of algorithmic settings so that Grok has suddenly become this kind of strange philo-Semite. I think we were saying on the podcast the other day that there is this odd connection between often anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism. Well, Grok is proving the point. It was asked to name the ethnic group that has made the single biggest contribution to civilization. It came back and it was asked for a one-word answer. Its one-word answer was Jews. And then it went into sort of heavy philo-Semitism mode, sounding off like all the Nobel Prize winners, Jewish Nobel Prize winners, and so on. I think my attitude would be, look, I prefer this version of Grok to the other one, but, kind of leave us alone. We're sort of backing away. It's like meeting someone at a party and backing away from Grok. So it's a very, with deep ambivalence, we suggest Grok for this category.
I'm for this version. Beggars can't be choosers. I want to add another Mensch award this week of the human type, if I may. And, a lot of Israelis listen to this podcast. And sometimes I ask them, why do you listen? Not of any sort of Anglo-Saxon background. And a lot of them would say, I love the conversation and I love the dynamics between you. But some of them would say, it helps me improve my English, which I always love it, actually, when people give us this answer. Jonathan, that English is my second language. So a big shout out to all of the English teachers along my life who helped me a lot.
They did a pretty extraordinary job. I think the listeners will agree. Amazing.
They do an okay job. And I think it's a good opportunity to mention Talma, which is the Israel Program for Excellence in English. It's a nonprofit initiative, and it advances English education. In Israel, they do this really lovely thing where they bring teachers to Israel, and just think of how pretty difficult that has been in the recent year or even 2 years. So several hundred come for the summer, and some of them even stay for the year. They teach in all, across the country in different areas. They also teach in East Jerusalem. It really is this beautiful, beautiful program. Talma has also been, a very warm supporter of this podcast. And I just wanted to mention them because I think it's really this beautiful initiative in which young people come. Some of them are Jewish, some of them aren't, and they teach English around Israel. And this is really an important thing. So we wanted to put them in our Mensch Award column as well this week.
Yeah, I think they edge ahead of Grok somehow, just for sheer human warmth. So yes, a very worthy choice.
So we're winding up our conversation for this week. Please do check out our global tour in August between different Jewish communities.
And of course, do check out, if you are a subscriber, if you're not, why not think of becoming one so you can hear our bonus episode this week. As Yonit mentioned, we get deeper into the whole issue of recognition of a Palestinian state. We take a deeper dive into that. That's available if you are already a family member or friend of the podcast. If you're not, why not use today to make that move? But there are lots of that coming on. And of course, as you say, our global summer tour coming throughout August.
And we were thank yous to Michal Porat, and I'll see you soon, Jonathan.
See you.